Thank you so much, Kaya and Joanna, and thanks everyone for having me. I realize there's a little bit of quiet mood music on in the background there, so I hope you all enjoyed that. So yeah, I'm really thrilled to be here. This is a really special place for me, a lot of really fond memories and a lot of fantastically smart and kind people to speak to. So I wanted to start out by acknowledging that I am on the traditional ancestral and unceded land of the Gabrielino Tongva people. And I like to, in my land acknowledgement, showcase some of the evidence, the positive evidence of folks continuing to live and thrive on their land and act as stewards for their land here. So today, and excuse my small coughing fit, I think it's going to pass. Today, I wanted to talk to you all about animal movement. So this is some footage from the MoveBank database that contains many animal species moving all across the world. And we have many movement phenomena in our world. We have about, I think it's something like 10 billion tons of phytoplankton moving up and down in the ocean column, about 1 kilometre every day. We've got 3.5 million migratory birds coming in from the south every spring, and about 4 million coming in from the north every fall into the States. There are a lot of really significant movements happening across the world. And of course, this movement is really critical for biodiversity. And we might say it's also undervalued. So that's one of the things I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, just as an introduction. Next, I'm going to be telling you a little bit about my work in how anthropogenic change has influenced animal movement at a global scale. And then finally, I want to speak a bit about how we can integrate animal movement into our efforts to conserve biodiversity and promote coexistence between animals and humans, other animals. All right, so let's start up by talking about why animal movement is critical and undervalued in biodiversity. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be talking about phytoplankton or schooling sardines today. I'm going to be talking mostly about highly mobile, large vertebrates, largely mammals. Large mammals, sorry, Jill. And so first of all, highly mobile animals have a really huge role in seed dispersal and in pollination. And so they're essential for the reproduction and maintaining the genetic diversity of a range of plant species across the world. Animal movement is also essential for moving energy between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So if we think about the width of a stream, we might have to up that width by an order of magnitude or more to really understand the ecological width of a stream in terms of how far that aquatic energy travels. And finally, I think, is Nick here? I've just been found out. So I wanted to, sorry, Nick Russo, yeah. Oh, hi, Nick. All right. So, okay, just so you know, it's going to be a little bit of a bingo today of UCLA folks that I've collaborated with. So, yeah, at the end, if you get it all in a row, I'll give you a prize. Okay. So Nick, I was lucky enough to be involved with Nick and, of course, Tom Smith and Elsa Ordway and Andrew Davies from Harvard on this fantastic paper. And one of the things that Nick pointed out in this paper was the outsized role that animal movement plays on structuring vegetation and how that role in structuring vegetation can persist over really long periods of time. And so animal movement can, in fact, even change fire regimes. Okay, but it is not all hearts and flowers, of course. So there are some species of primates that disperse very widely. So for relatively unpredictable reasons, seem to have nothing to do with reproduction or resource gathering. And they're often responsible for transmitting diseases far and wide across the world. That would be humans, in case anyone. And also, animal movement's really essential for understanding how invasive species spread across countries. Do they invade? So, I want to showcase some other rock stars from UCLA. So again, Nick, but also the lovely Kaya, Maddie, and Kat, along with Eric from University of Texas. We've been working in our broad movement ecology reading group on understanding the concept of movement diversity at different organismal, spatial, and temporal scales, because we think that being able to measure and understand how movement diversity interacts with other forms of biodiversity is going to help us make better conservation decisions. So keep your eye out for that one. Now, next up, I wanted to talk a little bit about my research into how anthropogenic disturbances are altering animal movement at a global scale. So we know that human disturbance can influence animal movement worldwide. So there's been some great research using the Global Human Footprint Index, which is a combination of infrastructure as well as population, etc., to show that in areas of higher global human footprint, we see reduced movement and we also see increased nocturnality. Now, I also wanted to mention some work done with some students, one UCLA undergraduate who's now an alumni, Adam, as well as a high school student who's now at University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD student, Ellie Bolus at UC Davis, along with the boys that I'll introduce properly later. We actually took a closer look at this relationship between wildlife, human disturbance, and nocturnality by studying the mountain lions of LA. So what you can see up the top here is a composite outdoor recreation index. And this is based on an outdoor recreation app called Strava, and it was developed by some scientists in Italy, Corradini et al., and it gives you a rough estimate of the spatial distribution of human presence across the landscape. And so what we did was we took a whole bunch of different mountain lion individuals and we plotted their home ranges across this landscape, and we found that there was a decrease in crepuscularity, or rather an increase in nocturnality, as we saw an increase in human recreation across the landscape. Now, of course, we need to remember that human presence and human footprint are two distinct things. So human footprint can be any type of infrastructure, buildings, roads, etc. And human presence is the actual presence of living humans. And we know that this can have very different effects on wildlife. For example, with coyotes. Coyotes are positively associated with human footprint, but not so with human presence. So thinking about separating those two, variability in human presence and human footprint, by the way, I've had nothing to do with this paper, let's put it up there. There was a great opportunity to do this during the COVID-19 lockdowns. And so Marley Tucker and 100 or so other people were able to assess how animals moved during these lockdowns in comparison to the times prior to lockdowns. And they found that animals were able to move more through the landscape and actually move more closely to perilous structures like roads. However, do we really need as dramatic an event as a global pandemic to be able to see how human changes in human activity influence mammals and their movement? Or can we detect these relationships at a much finer scale, say, during the week? We know that in recreational areas, in areas that we share with a lot of these mammals that are large enough to be tracked, we're moving into these areas a lot more during weekends than during weekdays. So can we detect an influence of humans on animal movement between weekends and weekdays? So this was the question that I asked under the supervision of Dr. Blumstein, as well with two fantastic undergrads, Lizzie and Adam, and Marley Tucker. And we were interested in whether we could detect a weekend effect. And so a weekend effect would be a difference in movement on the weekend compared with weekdays. So to do this, we gathered a whole bunch of GPS data from a bunch of different folks across the world, and we calculated speed using continuous time movement models and space use using local convex hulls, and we compared them using a log response ratio to estimate a weekend effect. So we're able to gather all of the animals that you can see on this phylogenetic tree, and we had a few predictions. So we're interested in, first of all, whether we could see a global evidence for a weekend effect across all mammals. But we're also interested in what drivers would make this weekend effect stronger or weaker. And so they could be intrinsic drivers, so the actual traits of the animals, such as body size or diet or activity, or they could be external drivers, so the actual human disturbances, talking about human population size or proximity to urban areas. And here's a sneak peek of what we found. So to talk you through this graph here, I'm just going to show you the space use results because they were the strongest. So these are graphs of weekend effective space use. On the left is the absolute weekend effect, and on the right is the directional weekend effect. So absolute weekend effect means that animals change their movement in some direction on the weekend compared to weekdays. So if I increased my space use by 10% on weekends compared to weekdays, that would be the same value as if I increased my space use of 10% on weekdays compared to weekends, right? So you can see that all of the values of those are positive. Directional weekend effect actually tells us which direction the weekend effect is going. So a positive value tells us that there's a greater space use used on weekends compared with weekdays. All right. So that's the first two things to notice are that there does seem to be an overall weekend effect in mammals. And in fact, we saw that space use changed by about 20 to 60% on weekends. But what was interesting was that the absolute effect was greater than the directional effect. And that could be for a number of reasons. Like that could be because the effect is masked by the fact that some animals are actually attracted to humans for things like the human shield effect. Or it could also be that there are differing strategies to avoiding humans, from hiding to fleeing. So the other thing that is useful to notice is that we have this relationship plotted against distance to urban area. And this was the relationship that was strongest among all the drivers. So distance to urban area, you can see that there's a positive relationship in both cases. This tells us that the weekend effect is strongest. Thank you for emphasis. Yeah. The weekend effect is strongest in areas that are actually further from urban areas. So this may at first seem a little counterintuitive because we expect the most people to be in urban areas and thus moving in and out of recreational areas. However, this actually may make a lot of sense if we think about the fact that in urban areas, there's more ability of these animals to be able to predict human movements, and they may have become habituated. Or we could see that in urban areas, more tolerant individuals have just been filtered out of those populations. All right, great. So it's a little bit of a glance on anthropogenic disturbances that impact animal movements. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how studying animal movements can help us conserve and coexist with animals. So to do this, I'll introduce properly my fantastic advisor while I was a Lacrette's postdoc here, Dr. Blumstein, as well as my fantastic external advisors, Dr. Seth Riley and Jeff Sikich from the National Park Service. So these guys have been studying mountain lions for 20 years now, so they really know their stuff. And I also wanted to acknowledge and thank Brad Schaefer, who dreamt up the Lacrette's program and is the whole reason that I had this fantastic opportunity and was able to live happily ever after doing California conservation, as is the plan. So the conservation problem we have here is we've got fires, we've got cities, we've got humans and mountain lions. So there are a lot of things going on that could provide issues for conservation and coexistence. So let's start out talking a little bit about mountain lions. So we know, so they're an apex predator. They're, in my opinion, the apex predator. Of course, there are bears, But honestly, they engage in a lot of kleptoparasitism, just being lazy and eating things that mountain lions have already killed. And, you know, there's a couple of wolves up the top, really. But, you know, give it a few years, we'll see. So they're the apex predator here in California. And you can see that they eat a range of prey, but their dominant prey that they eat, at least in Southern California, is mule deer. It's 90% of their diet. They prefer to eat deer. Now, they're also a solitary animal, and they're highly territorial. So mountain lions will only hang out together when they're breeding or when they're rearing young. And after that, after young mountain lions get old enough, they will disperse and find their own territories, which they will guard. Okay, so this is a map of California, of genetic structure of mountain lion populations here. And so the folks that that understand a bit about genetics across the landscape will see that there's quite a lot of structuring going on. So we have some large, robust populations, such as the Eastern and Western Sierra Nevada, but you see a lot of clumping here. So does anyone know why? Why would that be? Yes, freeways. Yes, exactly. Barriers to dispersal. So we have freeways and we have, I'm going to do that every now and then because I'm teaching now and it just comes naturally to me. Okay, so, and we have urban areas that are fragmenting these populations. And actually, so some of these populations are candidates for listing on the California Endangered Species Act as evolutionarily significant units. So really, really low effective population sizes, in some cases less than 30, right? So this is the situation that we're in terms of conservation of mountain lions in California. So what do mountain lions need in the landscape? Okay, they need things that normal organisms need. They need to reproduce, they need to find resources to persist. And so if we look at this landscape here, we can see that a few different heterogeneous structures would make up an ideal mountain lion landscape. So we need some cover here, and cover is useful because they are territorial and they can be very aggressive. So if you need to avoid an adjacent adult male, for example, then you'll need some cover to move around that area. They also are very, very shy of humans. They've been shown to avoid both human infrastructure and human voices, but not dog sounds, apparently. So we need cover to avoid adult mountain lions and humans. They also need cover to hide their adorable kittens for den sites. And they need other types of landscapes. So they need areas that are conducive to ambush hunting. So they ambush their deer. So they need a combination of high quality deer habitat as well as areas that they can hide to ambush them. And so in this case, it may be that edge areas near like high quality forage can have both high abundance of deer as well as capture opportunities. And finally, they need the right structures that will help them to move in an energetically efficient way through the landscape. Okay. In the context of California, we need to think about this through the lens of the fact that this state is the most fire-prone state and the most populous in terms of humans. So what that means is that we have very dramatic changes in vegetation structure regularly, and we also have the impact of humans influencing where and how these animals can use the landscape. So let's talk a bit about burn heterogeneity and how this might influence mountain lions across the state of California. So this is a collaboration with a number of different mountain lion scientists that you can see across this map. And all of these folks just happen to be studying mountain lions and tracking them with GPS collars when large fires came through their system. And so we have data tracking mountain lions before and during and after large wildfires. Now, in order to understand how they were using this post-fire landscape, we quantified their movement in two ways. So we looked at how they were moving through the landscape using step selection functions, and we also looked at where they were capturing prey. and where they were hunting using clusters of points to indicate kill locations. And here's what we found. So this little video here that you may have hypnotically been watching at the start before the talk, if you didn't have someone to chat to, is actually the Santa Monica Mountains. So UCLA is just over here somewhere. And you see when this little outline appears, that's the Woolsey fire in November 2018. And so you see how the mountain lions are moving, and there are these little worms here, how they're moving with respect to that fire. And you can see that they're largely, whilst before the fire, they're moving around in there. Afterwards, they're largely staying in some of those patchily burned areas or going in and out quite quickly. And we can see that in the fun way. You can also see it in the slightly more boring way with this coefficient plot. And this shows you the burned area selection effect size, which is the coefficient for selection both of after the fire minus for the fire. So a negative value tells us that mountain lions are avoiding the fire. So this is every one of these bars is an individual mountain lion. So you can see there's some variability, but the overall effect up the very top across the bar is negative. Okay, so overall avoiding the burned landscape. But what weren't they avoiding? So when we looked at kill sites, we found something pretty interesting. So to talk you through this, we have this graph here, which is basically a density plot. So the number of kill sites in different areas, different distances from the burned edge. And because there's already a distribution of available locations that changes with distance to the edge, I've plotted available kill sites. So this is just random points across the burned area. So you can see that before the fire, we have two distributions that pretty much match. And this is what the distribution looks like after the fire. So what I'll draw your attention to is that there's quite a large peak in the area that's about 200 meters from the burned edge. And so this is consistent with hunting near the burned edge, which makes sense in terms of ambush predation, and particularly since we know that mountain lions will drag their kills quite a long way from the hunting location in order to hide them. All right. Now, the other thing we found out was that mountain lions were selecting for heterogeneity in burned areas as they were moving through the landscape. And we did this again, so using step selection functions, and we found that areas of greater standard deviation in burn severity, so burn severity variability, were selected for over areas with less burn severity variability. And we compared this against just burn severity, against amount burned area, etc., and this was the strongest result. And so this diagram here is just to show you areas with low burn severity variability, which can be both A over here on the left, which is largely unburned, or A over on the right, which is largely burned, but still quite homogeneous. And then B, you can see that's an area with high burn severity variability, so a more heterogeneous area to move through the landscape. So this makes a lot of sense because of what we were talking about before in terms of the resources that are complementary that mountain lions require to persist in the landscape. And although Morgan's not here to shout out, if he's online, hi, this is consistent with a broader body of literature that shows that pyrodiversity or heterogeneity in burned area and fire regime will benefit biodiversity more broadly for a variety of taxa and at a variety of spatial and temporal scales. Okay, so now we've looked a little bit at the wildfire side of things. What happens when we throw human disturbance into this mix for mountain lions? Okay, let's go to the most burned and most populous area of California to do so. Why not? All right, so here we are. And here we are at UCLA. It's actually a love heart shape. Do people know that? Yeah, I only realized when I was putting this little point on. And here we have the area that mountain lions are using in this area. So Santa Monica Mountains and the areas surrounding. So what we need to keep in mind when we're talking about this landscape and when we're talking about fire in this landscape is that fire regime across California can be quite different. So if we're thinking about areas in Northern California, they have very different reasons for ignition and seasons for ignition. So they're largely fuel-based fires, they're less frequent, but they're higher severity, and they can generally burn more heterogeneously. Whereas in Southern California, as we know, we have the Santa Ana winds, these dry desert fern winds that will actually move with a lot of human ignitions to cause much more frequent fires that will actually level out the landscape and turn it into a moonscape. And so this is actually what burn chaparral should look like. This is a normal burn chaparral outcome. However, the issue is that we have such frequent fires that these chaparral plants cannot actually set seed and then continue to reproduce. Okay, so now that we have that in mind, let's talk about the Woolsey fire that happened in 2018. So the Woolsey fire covered this white hashed area. And so the mountain lion population that's been studied by Seth and Jeff for 20 years covers the Santa Monica Mountains and the Simi Hills, and they occasionally move up and down into the Santa Susanas above. But so the mountain lions living in this area, you can see that the fire took out like maybe half of the area that they were actually using, and it's gone right through the center of this area. As I mentioned before, chaparral fires are canopy fires, and so they really take out almost all of the vegetation in the landscape. And so there were some sad things, there were some fatalities. There was one mountain lion that actually died as a result of the fire from burn paws. There was another kitten that was found in a debris flow. But then the question was, how are the rest of this population doing in this post-fire landscape, cognizant of their need for heterogeneity and cover in order to get all the resources they need to persist? Okay. So one of the interesting things that we're able to ask in this situation is how they're going to trade off the different risks in this post-fire landscape. So they have a number of risks that they're facing. In an area with very, very little cover and presumably a more limited area to hunt, you need to be wary of intraspecific conflict. So that area was, there are a number of different mountain lion home ranges or territories within that area, and then large parts of them were taken out by the fire. So this really increases the chance of conflict especially between adult males. Now, the other source of conflict that they want to avoid is encounters with humans. And of course, in these open areas and moving into new areas, you may be encountering humans. So in this way, the mountain lions are forced to make some sort of choice about where they want to place their risk. So what we found was that they did increase their behaviors that put them at higher anthropogenic risk, right? So one thing we saw was that they increased their road crossings. And you can see here that they increased, let me see, from 2.5 to up to about 5 road crossings per month. But what was really notable and that we weren't able to look at quantitatively was the number of freeway crossings. So the first ever successful crossing of the 405 freeway, which is the busiest freeway in the country, allegedly, so the internet tells me, the first successful crossing of that freeway was after the Woolsey fire. And then when we looked at the number of freeway crossings before the fire, there was maybe one every 2 years of the big freeways, and then after the fire, one every 3 months. So interesting data. And the other thing that we noticed was that they were actually slightly increasing their daytime activity. So the activity outside of nocturnal and crepuscular times, which could also put them at risk of encountering humans. Now, this could mean a number of things. It could be that it's more favorable to avoid other mountain lions and encounter humans, or at least they're perceiving that. Or it could be that they have less habitat and availability for hunting and thus need to expend more energy and spend more time hunting. So either way, probably not great for them. Now, the other thing we found was that they also increased behaviors that put them at greater risk of encountering other mountain lions. And this included increased home range overlap, as you can see, particularly with males, and also increased distance traveled. And so these metrics can also point towards potentially an increase in energy use after fire. Now, what didn't happen, and this is where the coexistence part really comes in as well, was that people were really worried that mountain lions were going to be streaming into the streets and into their homes after the Woolsey fire because it took up so much of the area that they're using. But in fact, this didn't happen at all. In fact, so you can see here, like they used the urban areas maybe 5% of the time, both before and after the fire. And in fact, you can see this one individual here, and this is the fellow with the burned paws, actually started in this area where the triangle is and moved around. So you can see the hatched area is the burned landscape or the fire scar, moved around to an edge of the burned landscape, ran into some grey urban area, and then turned right back around and went straight into that burned area where he burned his paws. So this is showing that the perceived risk of the mountain lion of those urban areas is stronger than their perceived risk of that burned area. And so this is a really important point to think about when we're thinking about conserving these animals. What are their perceptions of risk in the landscape? And so if you're a mountain lion, then you tend to see the most urban areas as the most risky, or so the research has showed us. However, what actually is the most risky are these intermediate or suburban areas, because these are the areas that have the highest number of depredations. So this is the area where a lot of the human-wildlife conflict occurs, where mountain lions will take livestock or pets, and folks will apply for depredation permits in order to have them removed. And you can see from this map here that that removal does happen at quite a high rate. So interestingly, they are perceiving this higher risk in urban areas when really the highest risk is in the suburban areas. And this is also potentially the same thing with these post-fire landscapes. Now, of course, there are risks in urban areas. Okay, that's clear. Like you could potentially have a festival thrown for you, or someone could try and sing at you with a bunch of children, or maybe even draw a mural in your honor. So let's not forget these things. So to bring that together, I think it gives us a really great opportunity, and this is the work we're moving into now, to think about attraction and repulsion in our mixed urban natural landscape so that we can coexist better with these animals that we exist with, right? And so this is going to be really important in terms of wildlife crossings. So we have the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing that I know Jill is involved in planning from the bat perspective, and other folks might be involved in here, the largest in the world. And there's also a lot more funding from our governor for more wildlife crossings across California. So we're going to want to know how to attract animals to these crossings so that they can effectively use them. Additionally, and this is an interesting one, so folks will know, some folks will live in the area, I know Dan does, of the wildlife pilot program, which is the area between Griffith Park and the Santa Monica Mountains. And the LA City Planning Department are trying to maximize connectivity for wildlife while minimizing conflict for humans in that area. And so this is another great example of how we want two things that can be directly in opposition to each other. And if we can figure out how to both attract and repel these wildlife that are high risk for conflict, then we can plan these sorts of things a lot better. So how are we going to do this? We have some ideas. This is Amy Mainzer. She looks like a movie star because she's she's here. I've included this one because she was actually the scientific advisor for Don't Look Up. She's been collaborating with us on a project where we're using a whole lot of really fantastic remotely sensed data, including LiDAR and hyperspectral, to characterize these landscapes in a lot of detail. So this gives us a new opportunity when we're seeing mountain lions moving through urban areas. They're using microhabitats. They're using like tiny little riparian areas between buildings. And we can't pick that stuff up with a regular 30-meter pixel from Landsat, right? So we're figuring out how these landscapes are permeable to mountain lions, hopefully, and how we can integrate the ability for them to disperse with the ability for them to not get in trouble with humans. Right. Okay, so I want to leave a little tiny bit of time here. So to finish up, I wanted to say that really excited about delving more into animal movement as a critical aspect of biodiversity with the Movement Ecology group. And in terms of anthropogenic disturbances at the global scale, one of the take-homes here is that this can occur even during really short timeframes. So on the scale of a week, it doesn't have to be a global lockdown for us to influence animal movements with our presence. And in terms of studying animal movement and offering options for conservation and coexistence, it seems that understanding these movements can really help us inform, especially in these complicated urban and wildland interfaces, how we can design conservation solutions for highly mobile animals. All right, so now just a little sneak peek into my life at Cal Poly Pomona. So there is a lab door decorating competition for Halloween on at the moment. So I thought I would take a photo of my two master's students next to this incredible artwork that they have completed. So Betty is studying bobcats and Jamie is studying bats, and they were able to also integrate both of their spooky taxa into the door, which I thought was quite impressive. So one project that I'm working on that's also getting at how animal movement can tell us more about coexisting and conserving biodiversity is an agricultural project with a couple of my colleagues, Dr. Scordado and Dr. Questad. So we're working in the Santa Clara River Valley, which is actually the Santa Clara River is the largest free-flowing river in Southern California. So immense conservation value, but it's also very, very high agricultural value. There are high value crops there, such as avocados and lemons. And we're working with the orchard growers to see if we can align the goals of restoration with the goals of integrated pest management. So really excited about that project. And then I was hoping if we have time, a little bit of time? 20 minutes. Oh, 20 minutes, okay, great. Oh, great, I thought I was supposed to like leave 15 minutes for questions. Yeah, okay, great, wonderful. Okay, so if we have time, I wanted to talk a little bit about my work in diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion in academia, which I'm really, really passionate about as well. So first of all, and I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but we do have a problem in academia. And so this is just actually just looking at over on the right, these are SAT, a percentage of students who get an SAT score above 1300. So that's like that's a really, really good score. It's in the 87th percentile. But what we're seeing is that over all these students, this is actually the parents' income. It's not just the 1%, it's a top 0.1% that are getting all of these really great scores, right? Which is pretty wild. This is like an income of over $10 million, okay? So this is a problem. This is a problem if this SAT is measuring wealth, right? And then over here is another issue. So looking at US born students and students that have, the parents have a bachelor's degree or higher, or at least one parent has a PhD, and we can see the number of PhD students that are produced in these environments where they do have these parents that have this prior experience. So yeah, another problem for first generation college students. And of course, in Cal Poly, like in a lot of places, we're not doing super well at this. If you look at our rates of graduation, so we have, so we are a majority first generation campus, and we're a majority students of color. And also many students qualify as Pell eligible, which means they're lower income, right? So they're definitely in, the Pell students are definitely in there, right? So this is a challenge. And what we're seeing is that if not even doing, so you're supposed to graduate ideally in 4 years, but folks have other stuff on. So looking at the 6-year graduation level, we're graduating only 56% of men of color and 62% of women of color, while it's 76% for white students. So we have a big equity gap there, which is a really big problem. So talking about what makes these problems, we often think about this pipeline. So step one is enrollment. Now we often give ourselves a big clap if we enroll a lot of students from underserved and minoritized groups, and we get to call ourselves an HSI or an AN, AP, ISI, etc. We get this ranking for it. However, after that, we want to retain those students. So we don't want the students to drop out. And ideally, we want them to graduate. But then what about after graduation? There are various things we can measure. There's a social mobility scale, there's the wage, and there are even rankings for quality of life of jobs. But what does success actually mean? And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about sense of belonging and scientific identity, because it can be that students will make their way by hook or by crook all the way through this process, but still not be able to be their true, authentic selves and bring all the intersectional parts of their identity to their work in science. So that can happen. And also, sense of belonging and scientific identity have been tied to all of these other stages, success in all of these other stages through university. And some of the things that have been shown to really increase these two essential traits are having positive role models, having positive experiences in your field, intensive mentoring, community building, and having your experience valued. So valuing students' experiences as diverse as they are. So to tell you a little bit about some of the work we've started doing in Cal Poly around these issues, I'm going to first introduce diverse stories in STEM. And I am going to say I'm shamelessly including this QR code, which is for a fundraiser for this program, which ends in 2 days. So if anyone would be so wonderful as to share it on their social media, myself, Janelle, and Iman are all terrible at social media, and you would do us a huge favor. Similarly, for those of you that are just having cocktails with your showbiz friends later, just try and slip it their way, okay? Okay, great. So this is a program that we started. It has a couple of sections. So one section is that we are redeveloping our courses to incorporate assignments and exercises that reflect intentional anti-racist principles. And the other part is this fantastic seminar series that we've begun. So we've had our very first speaker, Dr. Christine Wilkinson from University of Berkeley, who is someone I think really embodies embracing your intersectional identity and bringing it to her science. So she's young and Black and queer and very proud and celebrating of all of these things in her glamorous work in carnivore ecology across Africa and California. So we bring, so Dr. Imana Taras and Dr. Janelle Ortiz and I bring speakers that are relevant to all of our classes. So animal behavior, ecology, and intro biology. and we have them speak to the students about the principles that we're learning, but also about their experiences in academia. And we're aiming to get a really diverse range of speakers who reflect the experiences of our students, because one person can't be all those identities to our students. And so far, we've had a really successful time. And Dr. Ortiz is also working in pedagogical research, and she is conducting a survey and will be publishing the results of this intervention and how it impacted sense of belonging and scientific identity in our students. All right. So this is another one that I've shamelessly included a QR code for. So yes, feel free. This is a really fun program called Fall Bat Week. And this program brings together 20 to 25 students, ended up being 25, and teaches them everything that Joy O'Keefe and I can possibly teach them about bats within a few days, right? We also had a very special guest star, Joey Curdy. Okay, bingo cards, everybody. Who was able to give many of these students their very, very first experience at night in nature, misnetting for bats. So really, really special. So we spend this time teaching these students about bats. They build a bat box with their own hands. They learn about bat conservation techniques and bat equipment. And then on the last day, on the Saturday night, the students themselves deliver a community outreach program to the community, which is really fun. So it's the first outreach event I've been to that I didn't talk about bats at all. And the students did really, really well. Okay, so then the last one, and just little mention, we've got Jill Carpenter up the back. She and I and Miguel Ordeñana from the Natural History Museum are also involved in this fantastic bat roost monitoring program where folks can engage in natural history research, not just near their homes, but in some places like South LA, like the LA River, that people would deem not worthy of biodiversity research. So this is a really fun one too. Okay, so I just wanted to thank everyone so much for having me here and hearing about my research and other activities. It's been a real pleasure, and I'll invite any questions. Should I look at the Zoom? Zach, yes.
Yeah, I got one, Rachel. That was a super cool talk.
Thank you.
For the selection functions for the cougars and stuff, I was wondering if there's evidence like that also looks like a selection function that I'd see probably for any ungulate favoring habitat heterogeneity, forest edge, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So how do you know that the pumas aren't just agnostic to landscape characteristics and only selecting for prey density?
Oh, such a good question. Yeah, so at the moment, we don't have that data on deer yet. But so Ellie Bolus is doing her PhD at UC Davis, and she's initiated a deer collaring program. And so she's collecting movement data from the deer at the moment. We also, I think she's also analyzing some data, some camera trap data from both the spring fire and the Woolsey fire, where we might be able to start to get at more of those predator-prey relationships. So you're right. We are missing that critical piece of the puzzle, which is what those deer are doing. And so we're really fascinated to see what the deer are doing and how the deer also interact with human disturbance. Like, are they using us as a human shield? Are there like trophic level effects of that? Like, there's a lot of great stuff that we're hoping to discover. Really good point. Yes, Kaya.
This is maybe a bit of a meta question, but when you were talking about the mountain lions adjusting their behaviors after the fires, potentially using more risky behaviors, is it possible that some of those behaviors might themselves be less risky because of changes in human behavior after the fire?
Ooh.
For example, maybe after a fire, it's not as big a deal to be out during the day because there are fewer hikers or something. It probably wouldn't affect river crossings, but other types of things.
Very astute question. Yes. So one of the things we looked at in the broader study, where we looked at multiple areas that burned, was we looked at the cumulative outdoor recreation index. to see whether these areas that were recreated in a lot, whether that would influence the use of these burned landscapes. And we didn't actually see anything. And that is quite possibly because of what you're saying, is that areas that maybe had a lot of recreation or have a lot of recreation as a rule, folks weren't necessarily using in the same manner, like within 15 months after wildfire. So yeah, there are a lot of complexities to disentangle there. And that's a really, really good point, that actually having access to live human data can tell us a lot more than having access to sort of more averaged spatial data. It's a good point. Thanks. Yes, Janine.
I have a question about the weekend effect.
Yes.
So you were looking at these natural areas, right? And these natural areas we expect more people to be about during the weekend. But I'm curious if we look at more urban areas and maybe like more urban species, like a coyote. Have you thought about like if those more urban areas have like higher human activity like, during the week? I'm thinking about like traffic is higher during the week, how that might like what's the relationship with the animals?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So one of the things towards that is one of the reasons we investigate the absolute weekend effect is because some areas were actually, they had different dynamics between weekends and weekdays. There was a change, but it was in the opposite direction. So the other point I wanted to make was that we actually suspect that that was maybe the case with LA, that we have folks recreating so much of the time in our natural areas. Maybe it's a bit more on weekends, but because of that degree of recreation across the board, that may be why we didn't detect necessarily a weekend effect in the mountain lions. And instead, we only detected that effect of spatial variability in human presence. So I think, yeah, it's a really excellent point. And some of the folks that are working on the Weekend Effect project are really interested in sort of delving a level further into some of those drivers. Excellent. Great. Yes.
Has anyone looked into age with the mountain lions? Some kind of way that may be influencing whether or not they're able to adapt to either urban or rural areas? Because maybe like an older mountain lion may have had prior experiences.
Yeah.
Maybe younger ones just don't know. I don't know about mountain lion learning, but this might be a way to have a look at that eventually.
Yeah, I think that's it's super interesting actually. And we so to answer your question, we had a little look at age with the statewide data set, and we didn't see anything come up, but again, it's a small sample size. And then I really wanted to look at age in the even smaller Santa Monica Mountains data set, because we have so much more information about those animals. We just didn't have the sample size to do it justice. But there were various anecdotal examples of like, okay, this is interesting. Like there was a lot more exploratory behavior in a couple of those younger mountain lions that were potentially a little bit more experimental. And maybe more willing to go into urban areas and investigate those areas because they hadn't had any kind of negative experiences yet. So a super interesting question that I was not quite able to crack, but will be very cool to think about in future for someone, maybe you. Oh, yes.
I was wondering if you think there may be any effect, because our local mountain lions are so genetically isolated and lack a lot of genetic diversity. Do you think that that has any effect on like behavioral plasticity or their ability to learn or like cognition and in terms of taking these risks? And do you think that maybe in like other more genetically diverse populations, you'd see something different because they might have different genes that let them, I don't know, learn about the landscape more easily or something like that?
I think that's an awesome question. Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, because we know that the genetic isolation is like really severe, especially in the Santa Monica Mountain population, because we're seeing these traits that have only been seen before in the Florida panther. So like multiple individuals have a kinked tail, which is a sign of inbreeding. We found there are a lot of like wacky, like kind of, I'm not sure, I'm sort of making this up, but 3-headed sperms and like just wacky shaped sperms. And there's also they've also been there was one individual I saw that only had one testicle. So there are physical traits consistent with inbreeding. And of course, like you say, that means a lack of genetic variability, and you would assume a lack of that ability within the gene pool to be able to adapt and evolve quickly to disturbances. So I think it's a super interesting question, but I don't know the answer to. But again, please chat to Seth and Jeff and see if you can find out. It's excellent future study. Yes.
So someone in the Zoom chat asked, when mountain lions increase behaviors that become an epidemic risk after wildfire, how long does this persist? Having already taken the response, are they more likely to engage in these behaviors again, even without a wildfire?
Yeah, such a good question. And again, I don't actually know the answer to that. So we have in the study I showed you with the road crossings. So that was a relatively short-term study, 15 months after wildfire. After that 15 months, the pandemic happened. So a lot of other drivers came into play that would influence the behavior of these animals. But in terms of the learning, I'm not actually sure, but that's something that we could potentially look at independent of the wildfire as well, to see to what degree animals were crossing roads. We know that some animals some individuals learned to cross roads safely, and so they would do that repeatedly. So there's a culvert underneath the freeway that a couple of the different animals discovered and were able to use. But in terms of the more risky encounters, that's something that hasn't been investigated yet.
One more question.
Yes.
I know we were talking about weekend effect and everything. And
Yeah.
This might not be like because we're suburban, but what like right now, a lot of places are hunting season right now, and so are you seeing a lot of responses to maybe the distribution of these mountain lions or other predators in response to having like hunters going out and like a gunshot could be dinner bell, and so changes in how they're moving through the landscape. I think just seasonally in this example.
Yes. Okay. So there were some actually. So we included season in our weekend effect analysis specifically to deal with that, because we know that animals can behave quite differently during hunting season and during non-hunting season, and as well hunted and non-hunted animals can change their behavior quite a bit. And we did see a weak effect of summer season in there that we haven't delved into further yet. But that's definitely something that we've talked about a little bit, is like getting together with the range of authors and really delineating when hunting seasons start and end, so that we can partition out that information and see whether we can make any links between those seasons and the degree of weekend effect. Yeah, so yeah, really good question. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.